This woman was left at the altar by her fiancé and raised her 4 children alone. Years later, an unexpected reunion changes everything. Subscribe to the channel and let's check out this complete story. Keisha Johnson smoothed her white gown, heart racing as she stood before the ornate chapel doors. At 28, the accomplished black woman was moments away from marrying Jonathan Carter, heir to a real estate empire. Their whirlwind romance had captivated Chicago's elite, though whispers of disapproval often followed Keisha into the city's most exclusive circles. As the string quartet began the bridal march, Keisha took a deep breath. This was it, her fairy tale ending. She'd overcome so much to reach this moment. Growing up in Chicago's South Side, she'd defied expectations, earning a full scholarship to Northwestern. Now a rising star at a top law firm, Keisha was ready to begin her happily ever after. The doors swung open. Keisha's smile faltered as she gazed down the aisle. Where was Jonathan? Their eyes had met across a crowded charity gala 2 years ago, and he'd pursued her relentlessly, unfazed by the raised eyebrows of his lily-white social circle. He'd promised this day would be perfect. Murmurs rippled through the pews as Keisha stood frozen in the doorway. Jonathan's mother, Regina, rose from the front row, her pinched expression a familiar mix of distaste and pity. She beckoned Keisha forward with a bony finger. Keisha's legs felt leaden as she approached, grip tightening on her bouquet. Regina pressed a folded note into her hand. "He's gone, dear," she said, voice dripping with faux sympathy. "Best to read this in private." The world tilted as Keisha stared at Jonathan's hastily scrawled words. "I'm sorry. I thought I was strong enough, but I can't go through with this. You deserve better. Jay." Keisha swayed, throat constricting as Regina's voice cut through the fog. Now? No scene. Please. We'll handle the guests. You should leave quietly through the side door." "I'm sure you understand." Anger flared, momentarily overpowering Keisha's shock. She squared her shoulders, meeting Regina's cool gaze. "I understand perfectly. Your son is a coward, and you raised him to be one." Gasps erupted as Keisha turned to face the assembled guests. "I apologize for the inconvenience," she announced, voice steady despite the tears threatening to fall. "There will be no wedding today. Feel free to enjoy the reception. I'm sure the Carters can afford it." With that, Keisha strode back down the aisle, head held high even as whispers followed in her wake. She ignored the pitying looks, the poorly concealed glee of social climbers who'd resented her presence in their world. None of them mattered now. Outside, Keisha gulped in the crisp autumn air, willing her racing heart to slow. How could she have been so blind? All those lingering glances from Jonathan's friends, the way conversation stopped when she entered a room, she'd attributed it to natural awkwardness, believing love would conquer all. "Keisha," a familiar voice called out. Her best friend Tanya hurried down the chapel steps, worry etched across her face. "Girl, what happened? Where's Jonathan?" Keisha's composure cracked. She collapsed into Tanya's arms, body racked with sobs. "He left," she choked out. "He couldn't go through with it. Couldn't marry me." Tanya's arms tightened around her. "Oh, honey, I'm so sorry. That spineless bastard never deserved you." As the reality of the situation sank in, Keisha felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She pulled back from Tanya, eyes wide. "I think I'm going to be sick." Tanya quickly ushered her to a nearby hedge, holding Keisha's hair as she retched. When the heave subsided, Tanya produced a water bottle from her purse. "Here, rinse your mouth. Let's get you home." Keisha nodded weakly, allowing Tanya to guide her to the waiting limo. As they settled into the plush leather seats, Keisha's mind raced. How would she face her colleagues on Monday? The pitying looks, the hushed conversations that would stop as soon as she walked by. She'd worked so hard to be taken seriously as a black woman in corporate law. Would this humiliation undo all of that? "Stop it," Tanya said firmly, squeezing Keisha's hand. "I can see those wheels turning. This is not your fault. Jonathan is the one who should be ashamed, not you." Keisha managed a weak smile. "Thanks, T. I really thought he was different. You know, that we were building something real." Tanya's expression softened. "I know, honey, but you're strong. You'll get through this, and you'll come out even better on the other side. I promise." As the limo wound through Chicago streets, Keisha leaned her head against the cool window. She'd rebuild, she told herself. She always had before. But the ache in her chest whispered that this time might be different. 3 weeks later, Keisha stared at the little plastic stick in her trembling hands, 2 pink lines mocking her. Pregnant. The word echoed in her mind. A mix of terror and something else. A fierce protectiveness she'd never felt before. She sank onto the cold tile of her bathroom floor, mind reeling. How could this be happening? They'd always been careful. Then she remembered that last night together, when Jonathan had seemed so passionate, so sure of their future. Had he known then that he was going to leave? Keisha's hand drifted to her still flat stomach. A baby. Jonathan's baby. How would she tell him? Should she tell him? The thought of facing him, of dealing with Regina's sneering disapproval, made her nauseous all over again. No, she decided. This was her child. She would face this on her own terms. The next few months passed in a blur of morning sickness, legal briefs, and hushed conversations with her doctor. At her 12-week scan, Keisha received another shock. Not 1 heartbeat, but 4. Quadruplets. The odds were astronomical, the doctor explained, especially without fertility treatments. Keisha laughed until tears streamed down her face. Of course, why would the universe grant her anything but the most complicated path forward? As her belly swelled, whispers followed Keisha through the halls of her law firm. She ignored them, throwing herself into her work with renewed determination. She would provide for her children, give them every opportunity. They would never know the struggle she'd faced growing up. At 7 months pregnant, Keisha waddled into a meeting with the firm's partners, cradling her enormous belly. She'd prepared meticulously for this moment, knowing the stakes. "Gentlemen," she began, voice steady despite her nerves. "I understand there are concerns about my ability to continue meeting the demands of this job once the babies arrive. I'm here to present my plan for the coming year." For the next hour, Keisha outlined a detailed strategy, demonstrating how she would balance her caseload with her new responsibilities. She'd researched progressive family leave policies at competing firms, showing how supporting her could give them an edge in recruitment. When she finished, silence fell over the room. Then, slowly, the managing partner began to clap. "Impressive, as always, Keisha," he said, a note of respect in his voice. "We'd be fools to lose you. Let's work out the details." Keisha's shoulders sagged in relief as she left the conference room. 1 hurdle down, countless more to go. But she would face them all, for the tiny lives growing inside her. The day her water broke, Keisha was in the middle of a deposition. She calmly excused herself, called Tanya, and took a taxi to the hospital. 18 grueling hours later, she held her sons for the first time. Looking down at their perfect brown faces, Keisha felt a love so fierce it took her breath away. "Welcome to the world, my beautiful boys," she whispered. "Mama's got you." As she drifted off to sleep, exhausted but exhilarated, Keisha didn't notice the commotion in the hallway. She didn't see Jonathan burst through the door, face pale as he took in the sight of his sons, and she certainly didn't hear the quiet sob that escaped him as he realized what he'd thrown away. "Keisha." Tanya's voice pulled her from the memory. You okay? You zoned out for a minute there. Keisha blinked, focusing on her friend's concerned face. They were seated in a bustling cafe, 3-year-old quadruplets squirming in their high chairs. Sorry, just thinking about how far we've come. Tanya smiled, reaching across the table to squeeze Keisha's hand. You've done amazing, girl. Those boys are lucky to have you as their mama. Keisha beamed at her sons, Malcolm, Marcus, Michael, and Miles. They were a handful, but they were her world. We're lucky to have each other, she said softly. As if on cue, Malcolm let out a squeal, flinging a handful of Cheerios across the table. Keisha laughed, reaching for a napkin. And on that note, I think it's time we head home for nap time. They were gathering their things when a hush fell over the cafe. Keisha looked up, freezing as she locked eyes with a face she hadn't seen in nearly 4 years. Jonathan. Jonathan stood rooted to the spot, his eyes wide with disbelief as they darted between Keisha and the 4 identical boys squirming in their high chairs. The cafe had gone eerily quiet, the tension palpable as other patrons sensed the unfolding drama. Keisha's heart raced, but she forced her voice to remain steady. "Hello, Jonathan," she said coolly, lifting her chin slightly. "It's been a while." He took a hesitant step forward, his gaze fixed on the children. "Are they—" He trailed off, unable to finish the question. "Yes," Keisha replied simply. She began efficiently wiping down the boys' faces and hands, pointedly avoiding Jonathan's stunned expression. Tanya stood protectively at Keisha's side, arms crossed as she glared at Jonathan. "You've got some nerve showing up here," she hissed. Jonathan flinched at her tone, but seemed unable to tear his eyes away from the quadruplets. "I had no idea," he murmured. "Keisha, why didn't you tell me?" A bitter laugh escaped Keisha's lips. "I tell you, you left me at the altar, Jonathan. You made it pretty clear you wanted nothing to do with me." The flush that crept up Jonathan's neck was visible even against his pale skin. "I know I hurt you," he began, "but these are my children. I have a right to—" "You have no rights here." Keisha cut him off, her voice low and dangerous. "These boys are mine. I've raised them alone for 3 years while you were off living your life. You don't get to waltz in now and play daddy." By now, the quadruplets had picked up on the tension. Malcolm began to whimper, setting off a chain reaction among his brothers. Keisha immediately shifted her focus to soothing them, murmuring gentle reassurances. Jonathan watched in awe as she expertly calmed all 4 boys, a longing expression crossing his face. "They're beautiful," he said softly. "What are their names?" Keisha hesitated, warring with herself. Part of her wanted to shut Jonathan out completely, to protect her sons from the man who had abandoned them before they were even born. But another part, the part that remembered the love they once shared, couldn't bring herself to be that cruel. "Malcolm, Marcus, Michael, and Miles," she finally answered, pointing to each boy in turn. A small smile tugged at Jonathan's lips. "The 4 M's," he mused. "Clever." An awkward silence fell over the group. Keisha could feel the eyes of the other cafe patrons on them, no doubt wondering about the story behind this tense reunion. She straightened her shoulders, determined to end this encounter on her terms. "We need to be going," she said firmly, beginning to gather the boys' things. "It was unexpected to see you, Jonathan." As she maneuvered the unwieldy quad stroller towards the door, Jonathan called out, "Wait, please, can we talk? I'd like to be part of their lives." Keisha paused, her back to him. She took a deep breath before turning to face him once more. "You lost that right when you walked away," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "My boys have everything they need." With that, she pushed through the cafe door, Tanya close behind. As they made their way down the sidewalk, Keisha's mind raced. She knew this wasn't the end of it. Jonathan had resources, connections. If he wanted to pursue this, things could get ugly. "You okay?" Tanya asked gently, placing a hand on Keisha's arm. Keisha nodded, forcing a smile. "I will be. Let's just get home." Over the next few weeks, Keisha threw herself into work and caring for the boys, trying to push thoughts of Jonathan to the back of her mind. But the nagging worry remained, intensifying when she received a certified letter from his lawyer requesting a paternity test and visitation rights. Keisha sat at her kitchen table late one night, poring over the legal documents with a growing sense of dread. She'd worked so hard to build a stable life for her sons. The thought of Jonathan disrupting that, of Regina's toxic influence seeping into their world, made her feel physically ill. A soft knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. Keisha frowned, checking the time. Who could be calling at this hour? She opened the door to find Jonathan standing there, looking uncharacteristically disheveled. "I'm sorry for coming by so late," he said quickly. I couldn't stop thinking about them. About you." Keisha's first instinct was to slam the door in his face, but something in his expression gave her pause. "The boys are asleep," she said quietly. "We can talk on the porch." They sat on the porch swing, an uncomfortable silence stretching between them. Finally, Jonathan spoke. "I know I have no right to ask this of you," he began. "But please, give me a chance to know my sons." Keisha studied him, noting the dark circles under his eyes, the way his hands trembled slightly. "Why now, Jonathan? It's been 3 years. Why show up in our lives now?" He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so familiar it made Keisha's heart ache despite herself. "Seeing you in that cafe, seeing our boys, it was like a wake-up call. I've spent the last 3 years trying to convince myself I made the right choice, that I wasn't ready for the responsibility. But the truth is, I was a coward." Tears welled in Keisha's eyes, but she blinked them back fiercely. "Do you have any idea what it's been like?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Raising 4 babies alone while working full-time. The sleepless nights, the constant worry." Jonathan hung his head. "I can't imagine," he said softly. "But I want to make it right. Please, Keisha, let me try to be the father they deserve." Keisha was silent for a long moment, weighing her options. She thought of her boys, how they sometimes asked about their daddy. How Malcolm's smile was so like Jonathan's, it made her heart clench. "I need time to think," she finally said. "This isn't just about you and me anymore. I have to do what's best for our sons." Jonathan nodded, relief evident on his face. "Of course, take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere this time, I promise." As he stood to leave, Keisha called out, "Jonathan!" He turned, hope flickering in his eyes. "If we do this, if I let you into their lives, you have to be all in. No more running when things get tough. They deserve better than that." "I understand," he said solemnly. "I won't let them down again, any of you." Keisha watched him walk away, her emotions a tangled mess. She had no illusions that this would be easy. There would be tough conversations, boundaries to establish, wounds to heal. But as she thought of her boys, of the family they could be, she felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could find their way to a new kind of happily ever after. As weeks turned into months, Keisha cautiously allowed Jonathan back into their lives. It started with supervised visits at the park, where he'd push the boys on the swings and marvel at their rapidly developing personalities. Malcolm, the oldest by 2 minutes, was already showing signs of being a natural leader. Marcus was the quiet observer, taking everything in with his soulful brown eyes. Michael was the comedian, always ready with a silly face to make his brothers laugh. And Miles, the baby of the group, was their fierce protector, quick to comfort any sibling in distress. Keisha watched these interactions with a mix of joy and trepidation. She couldn't deny the boys' excitement at having their father around, but a part of her remained guarded, waiting for the other shoe to drop. One crisp autumn afternoon, as Jonathan helped the boys collect colorful leaves, Keisha's phone buzzed with a text from Tanya. "Turn on the news. Now!" Frowning, Keisha pulled up a local news app on her phone. Her heart sank as she read the headline, "Carter heir embroiled in scandal. Secret family revealed." The article went on to detail Jonathan's hidden quadruplets and hinted at racial motivations behind his initial abandonment. Keisha's hands shook as she scrolled through the comments, filled with thinly veiled racism and judgment. "Keisha," Jonathan's voice pulled her from her spiraling thoughts. He stood before her, concern etched on his face, the boys clinging to his legs. "What's wrong?" She wordlessly handed him the phone, watching as his expression morphed from confusion to anger to shame. "I'm so sorry," he said quietly. "I never meant for this to happen." Keisha took a deep breath, pushing down her own tumultuous emotions. "We need to get the boys home," she said firmly. "We can discuss this later." That evening, after the quadruplets were tucked into bed, Keisha and Jonathan sat at her kitchen table, the weight of the day heavy between them. "I'll release a statement," Jonathan began. "Set the record straight." Keisha shook her head. "And say what? Exactly." "That you left me at the altar because your family couldn't handle you marrying a black woman? That you've spent the last 3 years pretending we didn't exist?" Jonathan flinched at her words. "That's not fair, Keisha. I've been trying to make amends." "Trying isn't enough." Keisha's voice rose, and she quickly lowered it, mindful of the sleeping children upstairs. "Do you have any idea what this will do to the boys? The scrutiny they'll face? The cruel things people will say?" Tears welled in Jonathan's eyes. "I never wanted this for them. For you, I thought I was protecting you by staying away." Keisha laughed bitterly. "Protecting us? From what? Love? Stability? A father's presence?" "From my family," Jonathan admitted quietly. "From the ugliness in their hearts. I was weak, Keisha. I let their prejudices cloud my judgment, and I've regretted it every day since." The raw honesty in his voice gave Keisha pause. She studied him, seeing the genuine remorse in his eyes. "Your family," she said slowly. "Do they know about the boys?" Jonathan shook his head. "Not until now. I've been trying to figure out how to tell them, how to make them understand." Keisha's mind raced, weighing their options. The story was out there now, impossible to contain, but maybe they could control the narrative. "We need to get ahead of this," she said decisively. "No statements, no hiding. We face this head on, together." Jonathan looked at her in surprise. "Together?" Keisha nodded, a plan forming in her mind. "You said you wanted to make amends, to be a real father to our sons. Well, here's your chance. We present a united front. Show the world that love and family come in all forms." A slow smile spread across Jonathan's face. "You're incredible. You know that?" he said softly. "After everything I've put you through, you're still willing to stand by me." "I'm not doing this for you," Keisha said firmly. "I'm doing it for our boys. They deserve to grow up proud of who they are, of where they come from, both sides of their heritage." The next morning, Keisha called in sick to work and contacted a trusted friend in public relations. By afternoon, they had a plan in place. They would do one exclusive interview with a respected journalist, telling their story on their own terms. As they prepared for the interview, scheduled for the following day, Keisha felt a mix of nervousness and determination. She was dressing the boys in matching outfits when a commotion downstairs caught her attention. "You have no right to be here," Jonathan's voice rang out, anger evident in his tone. Keisha hurried down the stairs, the boys trailing behind her. She froze at the sight that greeted her in the living room. Regina Carter stood in the center of the room, her normally perfectly coiffed appearance slightly disheveled. Her eyes widened as she took in the sight of Keisha and the quadruplets. "So it's true," Regina breathed, her gaze fixed on the children. "Jonathan, how could you keep this from us?" Before Jonathan could respond, Keisha stepped forward, positioning herself protectively in front of her sons. "Mrs. Carter," she said coolly, "this is private property. You weren't invited here." Regina's eyes snapped to Keisha's face, a flicker of recognition passing through them. "You," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "The girl from the wedding. I should have known you'd find a way to trap my son." "Mother!" Jonathan's voice was sharp. "That's enough. You will not speak to Keisha that way." Regina turned to her son, eyes flashing. "Do you have any idea what this will do to our family's reputation, to the business? Your father's beside himself." As the adults argued, Malcolm tugged on Keisha's shirt. "Mama," he whispered, his little face scrunched in confusion. "Who's that lady?" Keisha knelt down, facing her sons. "That's your grandmother," she said softly. "Your daddy's mama." The boys' eyes widened with interest. They'd heard stories about grandparents but had never met one. Miles, always the bravest, stepped forward. "Hi, Grandma," he said, his voice clear and sweet. "I'm Miles. These are my brothers." The room fell silent as Regina stared at the little boy. For a moment, Keisha saw a flicker of softness in the older woman's eyes, but it was quickly replaced by a mask of cool indifference. "Jonathan," Regina said, her voice tight. "We need to discuss this situation, in private." Keisha felt a surge of protectiveness. "Anything you have to say can be said in front of me," she insisted. "These are my children, too." Regina's lips thinned, but before she could respond, Marcus spoke up. "Mama," he said quietly, "can we show Grandma our drawings?" The innocent request seemed to deflate some of the tension in the room. Jonathan seized the opportunity. "That's a great idea, buddy," he said, smiling at his son. "Why don't we all sit down and get to know each other?" Regina hesitated, clearly torn between her prejudices and the undeniable pull of her grandchildren. Finally, with a stiff nod, she allowed herself to be led to the couch. As the boys eagerly showed off their artwork, chattering away in their toddler language, Keisha watched Regina closely. She saw the way the older woman's expression softened almost imperceptibly, the way her eyes lingered on each child's face. It wasn't acceptance, not yet. But it was a start. Later that night, after Regina had left and the boys were asleep, Keisha and Jonathan sat on the porch swing, processing the events of the day. "I'm sorry about my mother," Jonathan said softly. "Her behavior was inexcusable." Keisha sighed, leaning her head against his shoulder. "It's not your fault," she said. "But Jonathan, this is the reality our boys will face. The judgment, the prejudice. Are you prepared to stand with us, to fight those battles?" Jonathan took her hand, intertwining their fingers. "I am," he said firmly. "I've wasted too much time already. I want to be here, Keisha. For you. For our sons. If you'll have me." Keisha looked up at him, seeing the sincerity in his eyes. They had a long road ahead, filled with challenges and difficult conversations. But as she thought of their beautiful boys sleeping upstairs, of the family they could be, she felt a glimmer of hope. "One day at a time," she said softly. "We'll face it together." As they sat there, the cool night air wrapping around them, Keisha allowed herself to imagine a future where love truly could conquer all. The day of the interview arrived, bringing with it a whirlwind of activity. Keisha's living room had been transformed into a makeshift studio, with lights, cameras, and a small crew bustling about. The quadruplets, dressed in matching outfits, were a mixture of excitement and nervousness at all the commotion. Keisha took a deep breath, smoothing down her dress as she watched the renowned journalist, Diane Foster, set up her notes. Jonathan stood beside her, his hand resting supportively on the small of her back. "You ready for this?" he asked quietly. Keisha nodded, her jaw set with determination. "As ready as I'll ever be." As the cameras began rolling, Diane's warm smile put them slightly at ease. "Thank you for inviting us into your home," she began. "I know this isn't an easy story to tell." Keisha and Jonathan exchanged a glance before Keisha spoke. "It's not," she admitted, "but it's an important one. We want to set the record straight, not just for ourselves, but for our boys." As they recounted their story, the whirlwind romance, the heartbreaking wedding day, and the unexpected pregnancy, Keisha felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. For years, she'd carried the pain and humiliation of that day alone. Now, sharing it with the world, she felt oddly liberated. Jonathan's voice cracked as he described the moment he first saw the quadruplets in the cafe. "I knew instantly they were mine," he said, "and I knew I'd made the biggest mistake of my life by walking away." Diane turned to Keisha. "And how did you feel in that moment, seeing Jonathan after all that time?" Keisha paused, choosing her words carefully. "Angry?" she said finally. "Hurt, but also relieved in a way. The boys had been asking about their father, and I'd always hoped they'd know him someday." As if on cue, a crash sounded from the kitchen, followed by giggles. Keisha and Jonathan couldn't help but laugh. "And that would be our little troublemakers," Jonathan said fondly. Diane's eyes twinkled. "Perhaps we could meet them." Soon, the quadruplets were piled onto the couch between their parents, fidgeting and wide-eyed at the cameras. Diane's gentle questioning soon had them chattering away, showing off their unique personalities. "And do you like having your daddy around now?" Diane asked. Malcolm, ever the spokesman, nodded enthusiastically. "Daddy plays trucks with us and reads stories, but Mama does the best voices." The adults laughed, and Keisha felt her heart swell with love for her little family. This was what she'd always wanted, her boys happy, loved, and secure. As the interview wrapped up, Diane asked one final question. "What do you hope people take away from your story?" Keisha and Jonathan shared a look before Keisha answered. "That love isn't always easy," she said softly, "that it takes work and forgiveness and sometimes second chances, but it's always worth fighting for." Jonathan squeezed her hand. "And that family comes in all forms," he added. "These boys are a miracle, and we're committed to giving them the best of both worlds, both sides of their heritage." After the crew had packed up and left, Keisha collapsed onto the couch, emotionally drained. Jonathan sat beside her, pulling her close. "You were amazing," he murmured into her hair. Keisha allowed herself to relax into his embrace. "We did it," she said. "Together." The days following the interview were a whirlwind. The story aired, and suddenly, Keisha and Jonathan found themselves at the center of a media storm. Most of the coverage was positive, praising their honesty and the way they were navigating a complex situation. But there were also cruel comments, thinly veiled racism, and judgment from those who felt they knew better. Keisha tried to shield the boys from the worst of it, but she couldn't help feeling overwhelmed. One afternoon, as she scrolled through yet another online article, she felt tears of frustration welling up. A small hand on her knee made her look up. Miles stood there, his big brown eyes full of concern. "Mama sad?" he asked. Keisha quickly wiped her eyes, pulling her son onto her lap. "No, "Baby," she said, forcing a smile. "Mama's just tired." Miles studied her face for a moment before wrapping his arms around her neck. "I love you, Mama," he said simply. In that moment, all the noise and judgment faded away. This was what mattered, the unconditional love of her children. The following week brought an unexpected visitor. Keisha opened the door to find Regina standing there, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. "Mrs. Carter," Keisha said, surprise evident in her voice. "What are you doing here?" Regina cleared her throat. I saw the interview," she said. "I was hoping we could talk." Keisha hesitated for a moment before stepping aside to let her in. The boys were at preschool and Jonathan was at work, leaving them alone for this conversation. They sat in tense silence for a few moments before Regina spoke. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly. "My behavior, it was inexcusable." Keisha raised an eyebrow, waiting for her to continue. "Seeing you with the boys, hearing your story," Regina went on, "it made me realize how wrong I've been. Those children, my grandchildren, they're beautiful, and they deserve better than the prejudice I've held on to for so long." Tears glistened in Regina's eyes as she looked at Keisha. "Can you ever forgive me? Can we start over?" Keisha took a deep breath, weighing her words carefully. "Mrs. Carter," she began, "I appreciate your apology, but you have to understand, this isn't just about me. Those boys are half black. They're going to face challenges in this world, and they need a grandmother who will love and support them unconditionally. Can you be that person?" Regina nodded solemnly. "I want to try," she said. "I want to be part of their lives, to make up for lost time, if you'll let me." Keisha studied the older woman, seeing genuine remorse in her eyes. "It won't be easy," she warned. "There's a lot of hurt to overcome." "I know," Regina said, "but I'm willing to do the work. For the boys, for our family." As they continued talking, Keisha felt a glimmer of hope. It was a small step, but an important one. Perhaps, with time and effort, they could truly become a united family. Later that evening, as Keisha recounted the conversation to Jonathan, she saw a mix of emotions play across his face: hope, relief, and a touch of wariness. "Are you sure about this?" he asked. "After everything she's put you through?" Keisha sighed, leaning into him. "I'm not sure of anything," she admitted. "But I think it's worth trying, for the boys. They deserve to know all of their family, don't you think?" Jonathan nodded, pulling her closer. "You're incredible, you know that," he said softly. "Your capacity for forgiveness, for seeing the best in people, it's one of the things I love most about you." Keisha looked up at him, her heart skipping a beat at his words. They hadn't discussed their own relationship much, focusing instead on co-parenting and navigating the public scrutiny, but in moments like these, she felt the old spark rekindling. "Jonathan," she began hesitantly, "where do you see us going from here? You and me, I mean." He was quiet for a moment, his fingers tracing patterns on her arm. "Honestly," he said finally, "I see us building a life together, raising our boys, facing whatever challenges come our way. If that's what you want too." Keisha felt tears prick her eyes as she nodded. "I'd like that," she whispered, as they sealed their new beginning with a tender kiss. The sound of little feet padding down the stairs made them pull apart, laughing. "Mama! Daddy!" Marcus called out. "Can we have a story?" Jonathan scooped up their son, tickling him as Keisha went to gather the others. As they all piled onto the big bed for story time, Keisha looked around at her little family. There were still challenges ahead, prejudices to overcome, and a lifetime of explaining their unique situation. But in this moment, surrounded by love, she knew they could face anything, together. As the seasons changed, so did the dynamics of the newly reunited family. Keisha and Jonathan worked tirelessly to create a stable, loving environment for their boys, while also navigating the complexities of their rekindled relationship. The journey wasn't without its bumps, but they faced each challenge head-on, their commitment to their family unwavering. One crisp autumn morning, Keisha sat at her kitchen table, sipping coffee and reviewing a particularly challenging case file. Her law firm had been supportive of her situation, but she knew she had to work twice as hard to prove herself, especially now that her personal life had become so public. A knock at the door interrupted her concentration. She opened it to find Jonathan's father, William Carter, standing on her porch. His stern expression sent a wave of apprehension through her. "Mr. Carter," Keisha said, her voice carefully neutral. "This is unexpected." William's eyes darted past her, taking in the modest but well-kept home. "May I come in?" he asked gruffly. Keisha hesitated for a moment before stepping aside. As they settled in the living room, the sound of the boys playing in the backyard drifted through the open window. William cleared his throat. "I suppose I owe you an apology," he began, his discomfort evident. "My behavior, our family's behavior, it's been inexcusable." Keisha raised an eyebrow, waiting for him to continue. "Seeing that interview, watching Regina with the boys, it's made me realize how much I've missed out on," William went on. "Those are my grandchildren out there, and I'd like the chance to know them." Keisha studied the man before her, noting the mix of pride and vulnerability in his eyes. She thought of her own father, gone too soon, and how much she wished he could have known her children. "Mr. Carter," she began carefully, "I appreciate you coming here. But you have to understand, this isn't just about you or me. Those boys have been through a lot of changes lately. I need to know that if you're going to be in their lives, it's for the long haul." William nodded solemnly. "I understand, and I want you to know. I'm committed to making this right, not just with the boys, but with you as well. You're family now, Keisha. It's long past time we treated you as such." As they continued talking, Keisha felt a weight she hadn't even realized she was carrying begin to lift. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. Later that evening, as she recounted the conversation to Jonathan, she saw a mix of emotions play across his face: hope, relief, and a touch of guilt. "I'm sorry you had to face him alone," Jonathan said, pulling her close. "I should have been here." Keisha shook her head, leaning into his embrace. "No, I think it was better this way. He needed to see me as an individual, not just as your partner." Jonathan kissed the top of her head. "You're amazing. You know that. The way you handle everything with such grace and strength. I fall more in love with you every day." Keisha looked up at him, her heart swelling. "I love you too," she said softly. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" As if on cue, a crash followed by giggles sounded from the boys' room. They shared a laugh before going to investigate, hand in hand. The following months brought more changes and challenges. Keisha was offered a partnership at her law firm, a testament to her hard work and resilience. Jonathan, inspired by their journey, started a nonprofit organization focused on supporting diverse families and promoting racial understanding. Their relationship deepened, the trust between them growing stronger with each obstacle they overcame together. They were no longer just co-parents, but true partners in every sense of the word. One evening, as they watched the boys chase fireflies in the backyard, Jonathan turned to Keisha with a nervous smile. "I have something to ask you," he said, reaching into his pocket. Keisha's breath caught as he pulled out a small velvet box. "Jonathan." He took her hand, his eyes shining with love and determination. "Keisha Johnson, you are the strongest, most compassionate person I know. You've given me a beautiful family and a second chance I didn't deserve. Will you marry me? For real this time." Tears sprang to Keisha's eyes as she nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. As Jonathan slipped the ring onto her finger, cheers erupted from the house. They turned to see Regina, William, and Tanya standing on the porch, broad smiles on their faces. "You knew about this?" Keisha asked, laughing through her tears. Tanya grinned. "Girl, who do you think helped him pick out the ring?" As their family surrounded them with hugs and congratulations, Keisha felt a sense of completeness she'd never experienced before. This was what she'd always dreamed of: a loving partner, beautiful children, and a supportive family, no matter how unconventional. The wedding planning brought its own set of challenges: blending cultural traditions, managing family expectations, and dealing with renewed media interest tested their patience. But through it all, Keisha and Jonathan remained focused on what truly mattered: their love for each other and their children. On a warm spring day, surrounded by their closest friends and family, Keisha and Jonathan finally said, "I do." The ceremony was a beautiful blend of their cultures, with the quadruplets serving as adorable ring bearers. As they shared their first dance as husband and wife, Keisha caught sight of Regina wiping away tears, William's arm around her shoulders. Tanya stood nearby, beaming with pride as she bounced Keisha's youngest nephew on her hip. "What are you thinking?" Jonathan murmured, pulling her closer. Keisha smiled up at him, her heart full. "I'm thinking about how far we've come," she said softly, "and how excited I am for our future." Jonathan's eyes twinkled with mischief. "Speaking of the future," he said, "how do you feel about adding to our family? Maybe a little girl this time?" Keisha laughed, swatting his arm playfully. "Let's get through the terrible twos with the boys first, shall we?" As the night wore on, Keisha found a quiet moment to slip away, needing a breather from the joyous chaos. She stood on the balcony, looking out over the twinkling city lights. "Room for one more," Tanya's voice came from behind her. Keisha turned, smiling at her best friend. "Always." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment before Tanya spoke. "I'm so proud of you. You know that. You've been through hell and back, and look at you now. Partner at the firm, married to the man of your dreams, raising 4 amazing boys. You're living the life you always deserved." Tears pricked Keisha's eyes as she hugged her friend fiercely. "I couldn't have done it without you," she said. "You've been my rock through everything." Tanya pulled back, her own eyes suspiciously bright. "That's what sisters are for," she said simply. As they rejoined the party, Keisha felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over her. Her journey had been far from easy, filled with heartbreak, discrimination, and seemingly insurmountable challenges. But it had also been filled with love, growth, and unexpected blessings. She watched as Jonathan twirled each of their sons on the dance floor, their laughter ringing out above the music. Regina and William chatted amiably with her cousins, the barriers of race and class seeming to dissolve in the warmth of the celebration. This was her family, complex, imperfect, but bound together by love and a shared commitment to understanding and growth. As she stepped back onto the dance floor, pulling both Jonathan and the boys into a group hug, Keisha knew that whatever challenges the future held, they would face them together, stronger for the journey that had brought them to this moment. 5 years after their wedding, Keisha and Jonathan sat in the bleachers of the local elementary school gymnasium, watching with pride as their quadruplets participated in their first-grade talent show. Malcolm confidently recited a poem he'd written. Marcus showcased his budding artistic skills with a painting. Michael performed a silly magic trick that had the audience in stitches, and Miles played a simple tune on the piano. As the boys took their final bow together, Keisha felt Jonathan squeeze her hand. She looked over to see tears glistening in his eyes. "Can you believe how far we've come?" he whispered. Keisha smiled, leaning her head on his shoulder. It's been quite a journey, she agreed. Indeed, the past 5 years had brought both challenges and triumphs. Keisha had become a respected partner at her law firm, known for her work in family law and civil rights cases. Jonathan's nonprofit had grown, gaining national recognition for its efforts in promoting racial understanding and supporting diverse families. But their greatest achievement was the loving, stable home they'd created for their sons. The boys were thriving, their unique personalities blossoming in an environment of unconditional love and support. After the show, as they gathered their excited children, Keisha noticed a woman approaching them hesitantly. She recognized her as Mrs. Thompson, Miles' teacher. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter," Mrs. Thompson began, her expression serious. "I was hoping I could speak with you for a moment about Miles." Keisha felt a flutter of concern. "Is everything all right?" Mrs. Thompson glanced around before lowering her voice. "There's been an incident. Some of the other children have been making insensitive comments about Miles' family, about your family." Keisha's heart sank as she exchanged a look with Jonathan. They'd known this day would come, but it didn't make it any easier. "What kind of comments?" Jonathan asked, his jaw tightening. Mrs. Thompson looked uncomfortable. "They've been asking why Miles' skin is darker than yours, Mr. Carter, and one child told Miles that he couldn't really be your son because of it." Keisha felt a surge of anger and pain, but she took a deep breath, centering herself. "How did Miles handle it?" A small smile crossed Mrs. Thompson's face. "Actually, that's what I wanted to talk to you about. Miles handled it beautifully. He told the other children that families come in all colors, and that love is what makes a family, not matching skin." Pride swelled in Keisha's chest as she looked over at Miles, who was laughing with his brothers, blissfully unaware of the conversation. "We've tried to prepare them for moments like this," Jonathan said softly. "But hearing about it actually happening..." Mrs. Thompson nodded sympathetically. "I wanted you to know that we're addressing this with the other children and their parents. We don't tolerate any form of discrimination in our school, but I also wanted to commend you on raising such a compassionate, articulate young man." As they thanked Mrs. Thompson and gathered their boys to head home, Keisha felt a mix of emotions swirling inside her. Pride in Miles. Response. Pain that he had to face such ignorance at such a young age, and a renewed determination to continue their work in promoting understanding and acceptance. That night, after the boys were in bed, Keisha and Jonathan sat on their back porch, processing the day's events. "We knew this would happen eventually," Keisha said softly, "but it doesn't make it any easier." Jonathan pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. "No, it doesn't, but we've prepared them as best we can. And Miles? He handled it better than I probably would have at his age." Keisha nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "He's got a strong sense of self. That one, all our boys do." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment before Jonathan spoke again. "You know, I've been thinking, maybe it's time we expanded our family education programs at the nonprofit, reach more schools, start the conversations earlier." Keisha sat up, her eyes shining with excitement. "That's a great idea, and maybe I could do some pro bono work, help families facing discrimination in schools." As they brainstormed ideas, Keisha felt that familiar spark of determination igniting within her. This was why they'd shared their story, why they continued to be open about their journey, not just for themselves, but for all the families out there facing similar challenges. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Keisha threw herself into researching education law, while Jonathan worked on expanding his nonprofit's outreach programs. They had several frank, age-appropriate discussions with the boys about race, identity, and the ignorance they might face. One evening, as they were preparing dinner together, Miles approached them with a serious expression on his young face. "Mama, Daddy," he said, his voice small but determined. "I want to tell our story at school. Can I do that?" Keisha and Jonathan exchanged a surprised look before kneeling down to Miles. "Level." "Of course you can, buddy," Jonathan said gently. "But why do you want to do that?" Miles fidgeted with the hem of his shirt. Because if people knew our story, maybe they wouldn't say mean things. Maybe they'd understand that families can look different and still be full of love." Tears pricked Keisha's eyes as she pulled her son into a tight hug. "That's a beautiful idea, baby. We'll help you prepare if that's what you really want to do." Over the next few days, they worked with Miles to create a simple, age-appropriate presentation about their family. They included photos, a family tree, and even a few of the boys' favorite recipes that blended both sides of their heritage. The day of Miles' and presentation arrived, and Keisha and Jonathan sat nervously in the back of the classroom, hearts swelling with pride as their son stood confidently before his peers. "This is my family," Miles began, pointing to a large photo of all of them together. "We might not all look the same, but we're connected by love." As Miles continued, sharing anecdotes about family game nights, holiday traditions, and the special handshake he had with each of his brothers, Keisha noticed the other children leaning forward, engaged and curious. When he finished, Mrs. Thompson opened the floor for questions. Keisha held her breath, afraid of what might be asked. But to her surprise and relief, the questions were innocent and genuinely interested. "Do you celebrate both Christmas and Kwanzaa? What's your favorite food that your mom makes? Can you teach us your special handshake?" As the QA session devolved into Miles enthusiastically demonstrating the handshake to his classmates, Keisha felt Jonathan's arm wrap around her shoulders. "We've got some pretty amazing kids," he murmured. Keisha nodded, too choked up to speak. This moment, watching their son proudly sharing their family's story, felt like a culmination of everything they'd been working towards. In the months that followed, Keisha and Jonathan's efforts to promote understanding and acceptance gained momentum. Keisha successfully lobbied for more comprehensive diversity training in local schools, while Jonathan's nonprofit partnered with educators to develop curriculum that celebrated all types of families. Their story, once a source of scandal and judgment, became an inspiration. They received letters from other interracial couples, from adoptive families, from people who saw themselves reflected in the Carter Samoa journey. One evening, as they watched their boys playing in the backyard, Keisha turned to Jonathan with a mischievous smile. "You know," she said casually, "I've been thinking about what you said at our wedding, about adding to our family." Jonathan's eyes widened. "Are you saying—" Keisha nodded, her smile growing. "I think it's time. What do you say we try for that little girl?" Jonathan swept her into his arms, spinning her around as they both laughed. As he set her down, he cupped her face gently. "I say yes," he said softly, "to everything, to growing our family, to facing whatever challenges come our way, as long as we're doing it together." As they shared a tender kiss, the sounds of their sons, laughter floating on the evening breeze, Keisha felt a profound sense of peace. Their journey had been far from easy, marked by pain, prejudice, and misunderstanding. But it had also been filled with love, growth, and the joy of creating a family that defied expectations. She thought back to that heartbroken young woman left at the altar, to the single mother struggling to raise quadruplets alone. If she could have seen this moment, would she have believed it possible? As Jonathan called the boys in for dinner, each of them racing to be the first to reach their parents, Keisha knew the answer. This life, this love, this family, it was more than she had ever dared to dream. And as they all piled into a group hug, laughing and tickling and full of joy, she knew that whatever the future held, they would face it together, stronger for the journey that had brought them to this moment. The story of Keisha and Jonathan Carter, once a tale of heartbreak and prejudice, had become a testament to the power of love, forgiveness, and the beautiful complexity of family. And as they looked towards the future, excited for the new adventures and challenges it would bring, they knew that their greatest legacy would be the love and acceptance they were nurturing, not just in their own children, but in the world around them.